Hello, everyone. So today we're going to be touching on common designs. And let me switch gears. For today's module, we are going to focus on understanding what is a design system, identifying common design patterns, and then we're also going to talk about how we can turn our wireframes into high-fidelity mockups. Before we get started with the module, are there any questions regarding the assignment that took place or the module that we reviewed yesterday related to layout grids or baseline grids? Okay. All right. So let's make sure we have our cameras on, and I'm going to flip over to our module. All right, so let's dive into design systems. We've talked a little bit about them, not so much the last week, but you all actually have been gradually building towards one. And as companies and design teams have grown over the years, they've begun running into the same problem. Bespoke design doesn't scale. For example, creating components based on new cases isn't sustainable, and this creates discrepancies between design teams. So just imagine if we were all working on a design project together, and if we were all creating components on our own, our overall experience would not feel cohesive. If then we were to take the same project that we've all worked on and hand it over to our development team, they would ultimately get confused. And once the product has actually launched, customers would wonder why their interface had 5 different buttons or why their experience felt very disjointed with one another. So one way that we can combat this issue is developing what we call a design system. This is an example that was pulled from InVision's Design Systems Handbook. And this is a UI audit that they had done on a company. And what they discovered was that this specific company was actually using a multitude of different designs for its buttons. So if we take a look on the right-hand side, we have all these different buttons that they pulled, different heights, different weights, different font sizes that are used. So we have an add to cart that is using a regular font style, but then towards the bottom, there is a button that is bolded where it says add to cart. Even in terms of some of the languages that are used as well. So we have something that says check out what's trending, used as a button, where a lot of their other buttons focused on the verb first, so add to cart, check out. Then we even have a button on the top right hand where it says contact the shop, which makes this look drastically different than all the other buttons, just because we have a text stacked on top of one another, making the button extremely large in comparison to the others. So this is something that we want to avoid when it comes to creating our designs. And so what will typically happen is when designers are given free range to execute their visions, their overall product suffers because there's no unifying identity. And as this issue becomes more problematic, designers realize that they could use design systems to standardize their work. And as InVision explains, enable teams to build better products faster by making designs reusable. So what is this magical tool to help us solve this fundamental design problem? And as Audrey Hack explains and illustrates in Everything You Need to Know About Design Systems, I keep hearing various definitions, so let me start by saying what a design system isn't. It's not a sketch library, no more than a style guide or a pattern library. Actually, it's all of this and so much more. A design system is a single source of truth which groups all the elements that will allow the teams to design, realize, and develop a product. So a design system is not a deliverable, but a set of deliverables. It will constantly evolve with the product, the tools, and the new technologies. And this is true Oftentimes we see brands who rebrand and their entire design system will change as a result of that. Even as we're building out our experiences, what we're building for Build Week, our components could change once we get into Build Week, once we've spoken to the developers. So there might be some slight tweaks that need to take place. So your design system is never final. Your style guide is never final. There's always going to be changes that you'll need to make according to certain circumstances. Any questions on why a design system is so important before we actually go into the details of how we take one apart and understand what it means? So I think this image that we have in front of us is really important, and just keep it in the back of your head. So as you're designing out your mock-ups and you're converting your wireframes into high fidelity designs, just make sure that we're staying on top of our master components, we're staying on top of all of these little pieces, so that way we're not using 5 random buttons, or we're not using 3 different types of drop downs. Okay. So to continue on, Audrey makes several important points here. In particular, she points out that we frequently conflate deliverables like style guides and pattern libraries with a design system. Instead, those deliverables can be part of a much bigger design system. So let's get into what else does a design system cover besides those deliverables. And at a high level, design systems lay out the big picture vision and standards that designs should follow, and then provide the written and contextual documentation necessary to achieve that vision. Since this is such a broad description, design systems tend to differ widely between companies, but they typically share the following pieces. The first is a purpose, shared values, and/or vision. So before anything else can happen, we need to align with our design teams, or even with our business stakeholders, around a shared target. Being able to, for instance, articulate what our overall goals and strategy are for our design systems helps guide our work over time and ensures that we stay focused on activities that deliver value to our teams. And so we can definitely see this highlighted on the right-hand side here. One of the things that goes into this design system are principles. What are the goals? What are the objectives? What is the purpose? Next, the second piece to focus when it comes to building out a design system are design principles. And so once we've aligned our team around a shared vision, we can develop design principles that help us execute our vision by guiding our design choices. This will help our team make design decisions that further advance the objectives of our product. Then we have our brand identity / style guide. So we've worked a little bit towards our style guide. There was the little, if we think back to the lesson that we had during our sprint Q&A. So now that we're starting to get into the details of our design system, our brand identities should articulate the various facets of a visual communication system. And this can include things like your typography, motion, color palettes, spacing. As we work towards this design systems, the next category would be components and patterns. Once we have a visual communication sorted out, we can begin to bring our language together to create interface components and patterns. We can think of the components as the Lego blocks we use to build up our designs, and patterns as the instructions that allow us to use our components consistently. As Nathan Curtis explains, and patterns does not equate to components. Components are how something does work, inclusive of trade-offs and constraints realized through a build process. Patterns describe how something should work under preferred conditions and suggestions of how to cope with trade-offs. So as an example, components are going to be the interface chunk to be added to an overall layout, whereas patterns may be a UI or a variety of other things, like a behavior, a flow, application motif, or something else. Completed components exhibit a visual language and polished, precise detail, yet patterns are independent of any particular skin and flexibly adapts across any visual language. So when we talk about components to get more detailed and to build upon what was just mentioned, components are things that we already probably have in place as part of our master components. These are our buttons, these are our text input fields. But then as we start moving over to patterns, patterns could be, for example, what does the loading state look like? Or for example, what happens when an error occurs? So this is going to be more so behavior driven. So as we define our common components and patterns, we begin to see tangible value from our design systems. These components help our teams design consistently, prototype faster, iterate quicker, and improve usability and accessibility. And then finally, we have our best practices. Just like we provided additional context for visual language, we can also make sure that we help our teams use and implement our design systems through best practices. These guidelines not only help our teams use our design systems, but they help us onboard new designers and level up junior ones by codifying our collective design experience. During best practices, this is where you can document how your team has successfully utilized and implemented the design system in their own work. And a good place to start is by documenting how one team started using the design system and then successfully embedded it into their daily workflow. As a result, you'll have a blueprint for other teams to follow as they start to use the design system. As a reminder, again, design systems aren't a one and done project. They are living documents that are going to evolve over time. So make sure you have a plan in place to keep it up to date. Now, what I would like to do next is actually show a design system that some of you may have seen. I had added the link in Slack, but we'll look at IBM's Carbon design system. But before I move on to that, I wanted to see if there were any questions related to any of these categories that we reviewed. Okay. All right, so we're going to take a look at IBM's design system, which they've called Carbon. And let me switch gears. All right, and I'll share this with you all. Okay. So remember, a design system is going to be a collection of repeatable components along with a set of guidelines. So having a design system in place means being able to assemble those components to put together a design. And a lot of the guidelines that we went over previously related to how we can set up a design system can be shown in Carbon's design system. So the first piece that we went over is making sure that your design system has an overall purpose, shared value, or vision. And we can see this when we go into this introductory page all about Carbon itself. So if I think back to what the goal of a purpose, shared value, or vision is, we see that Carbon highlights this in their design system. And what they focus in on are a few goals. So some of the things that they point out here is that their design system is all about making sure that they're improving upon UI consistency, making sure that the design and development process is more efficient, establishing a shared vocabulary, and ensuring that there's a guidance around design and development best practices that we can all gather from the introduction here. So they've got this vision in place. And the next thing that they also focus on, which you'll see in design systems, are design principles, which they've named as guiding principles as we continue to scroll down. So after reviewing Carbon's shared vision, they've developed these principles that will help users make their design decisions. For example, a few to pull out here is that Carbon is inclusive and is meant to be accessible by all. And another really great one here is that they're really focused on putting the user first, that the components and patterns and everything as part of their design system has been backed up by research, so that way we're able to support those users that are using the product. Then next, moving on to the third piece related to brand identity and style guide, we can move over to their guidelines. And so as a reminder, the brand identity is going to go into the details of a design system. It will articulate categories like color, spacing, typography. And as an example, if we go into color, we can see that they have a palette that is focused on highlighting their primary colors. They also have accent colors that we see here. And as we continue to scroll down, they also talk about, they highlight do's and don'ts. And so for example, talking about certain themes, light themes that users might be using as they're building their product. For example, having this gray 10 drop down on a white background. So that's good, but then on the other hand, making sure that we're avoiding these use of midtones. So we can see here there's a big difference between the way that these two are shown, where this is a little bit clearer in terms of being able to identify the option that you'd like to move forward with, whereas this doesn't provide too much contrast. So another thing that separates a design system from just a regular style guide is that they will not only showcase what, for example, in this case, the color palette, but they'll also take a deeper dive as to how you can use colors. What are the right ways to use colors? What are the wrong ways to use colors? And if we actually go into the usage tab, this is where we could go in and find all of our hex values. They've also specified it by the name of the element. So for example, here, their background defaults to this white color. Their primary color defaults to what they're calling a blue 60. And everything is listed out here, so there's no ambiguity as to what colors associate with which components. And so as you can see here, by being able to provide this type of guidance, we're able to help design teams consistently use colors across the products. Another thing that I also would like to showcase is the content. So we talked a little bit about copy yesterday, and Carbon Design System also has its own guidelines as to what the voice and tone should sound like. Overall, they really focus on making sure that their content feels conversational, that everything is very clear and concise. And what's really great about this particular design system is they also talk about different conversational levels. So for example, they have it broken out by less conversational to most conversational, depending on the type of, depending on the scenario. So less conversational would be more focused on asking the user to complete a task, versus something that's more conversational, which we can see in this example, which is a little bit more wordy, less concise, as if you were asking the user to complete an individual task. Any questions on the brand identity or style guide so far?
I have a quick question about the purpose and shared values. Isn't that going to be the same across all companies? I mean, shared values are just going to be very similar.
Yeah, I would say that as you start to look at more and more design systems, there's going to be, you'll see overlap or consistency between what the shared values are. There might be a slight variation between them, but in terms of just like the overall goal, making sure that everything is just consistent for the user, that is going to be a big theme that you'll see across all design systems.
Great, thank you.
Sure. Other questions? All right. So let's move on to our components and patterns. And so once we've finalized our visual communication, then we're able to start creating our components and patterns. So remember that components are going to show how something works, and patterns are going to describe how something should work under preferred conditions. This Carbon design system has a variety of components listed on the left-hand side here, and this is going to be something I think that we're all familiar with because we have been working with components for the last 2 weeks. But the great thing about the way that is set up here is if I were interested in learning more about buttons, we see that it's broken out by highlighting how buttons, what the primary buttons are. If we continue to scroll down, we also see how Carbon highlights examples of how to use buttons in specific scenarios. And so we have a couple of here, danger button, a small primary button. And even if we get down to a more granular level when we're going into usage, there's also specific guidelines that illustrate how to use these buttons. And so there will also be a lot of visuals that will be displayed as to what that looks like, getting as detailed as button alignment. And so this sort of guideline really helps designers when it comes to putting together their product experiences, because it's almost like this do's and don'ts, so that way they have a visual reference. We're going to talk more about components for the second half of class. So for some of you who may not be familiar with some of this terminology, that's okay. We'll be going over some common ones. And then the next piece that we have are our patterns. So our patterns, again, describing how something should work given a specific behavior. And good examples of this that I don't have listed here, but that we can think of are skeleton states. So if any of you have used Facebook, I think Facebook does this, where they're waiting for the page to load, but you would just see blocks, gray blocks. That is known as a skeleton state. And so this happens when a page hasn't fully loaded. Another example could be, oh, we have skeleton states here, awesome. So this is an example of a skeleton state that IBM has highlighted in their design system. They also go as far as how to use them. And then another example could be progressive loading, which is what they use in order to load pages in batches. And so here we can start to see that the page is loading. Once the button's set, that appears, and it gradually builds upon that. Other patterns that they have listed here that I've also seen frequently in designs are disabled states. So where things are disabled because you're unable to click on them. And these are some examples. So they have enabled states for the drop-down option, whereas something is disabled, for example, option 2, this is how it would be portrayed. What questions do we have about components and patterns? All right. So other resources that I would love for you all to take a look at when you have some extra time is this Adele resource. So Adele has a library of design systems that you can look at. IBM's Carbon Design System is just one example. But if you were interested in looking at, for example, Priceline, Priceline has their own design system. You can see how it's built by taking a look at the different color palettes, how their topography is set up, these primary components that they use. So if one of the great ways to understand different components and how they're named is just by going to a variety of different design systems and seeing the naming convention that they use. There might be slight variances. So for example, something that you see in iOS or material design, which we'll get into tomorrow, they have very specific terminology that they would use. So if you were to build an iOS application, or if you were to build a material design application, you would use their language to talk to developers so that there's a common understanding. Trello is another resource that's available. So they have their design principles laid out. If we take a look at components, they even have a writing style that we can refer back to. And they even have these broken down as well, which is really great. And then there's another design system called Design Systems Gallery that I'll share with you all too. This is another resource that you can refer to if you're interested in just seeing how, for example, style guides are set up. And they'll have a whole list that may overlap with what you see in Adele. So for example, they do have Trellos here as well. So for your assignment this afternoon, because we touched on design systems, you will not be required to build out a design system. What I will have you all focus on is really building out a style guide, focusing a lot on making sure that you have your typographic scale, your color palette, your components, and your patterns. That is going to be really useful when you all get into build week. But as a stretch goal, if you'd like to start thinking about what the vision is, so that way it could eventually develop into a design system, you will have the freedom to do that. But I think that just introducing what design systems are is going to be really beneficial just to have that in your back pocket. And then also, as you continue to build upon your components and patterns, you can refer back to this to also get inspiration. All right, so what questions do we have about design systems in general?
I had a clarification question of the difference between design system versus style guide and how you would use those two in different contexts.
Yeah, that's a great question. So a style guide, if we take a look at what we looked at on Friday, this is going to be more of a style guide. And I say that because I have just purely listed out what the topography is. I've listed out the components, but what I haven't done, which is different than a design system, is actually show you how you're supposed to use them. This is just a bunch of components, patterns, color palettes, and typefaces. Whereas a design system is going to get much more detailed, where they talk about its overall vision, its goals. They'll talk about how to use specific components. So if we think back to the do's and don'ts, they will actually show an example of this is how you should be using color. This is how this should be set up so you're paying attention to accessibility as an example. That is going to be the biggest difference between the two.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Other questions related to design systems?
I had one. So a design system would have more text, like a.
It's, yeah. So I would say it's going to be much more text heavy.
I see. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in this example, normally in a style guide, we would just have maybe an image of what this looks like when it's enabled and an image of what it would look like if it was hidden. And we wouldn't normally have fuller context as to what that could look like.
So it's like a user manual for a company's branding and styling and design system.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great way to put it. Like almost like basically a user manual. Are there questions on design systems?
I've got one. So who goes through and writes these out? Is it like senior UX designers or it's probably got to be UX designers. I think I just kind of answered my own question, but yeah.
Yeah, so it's going to vary across team. Thinking back to my previous team, we had a couple of UX designers and more so visual designers that worked on the design system. And that would be their job to flesh this out and make sure that it feels cohesive. They also partnered with our developers too to make sure that not only did it look good when we're staring at a static screen, but they were also able to implement it. So there's a lot of collaboration between these two groups.
Gotcha. Cool. Thanks.
Sure. Okay, other questions before we move on to patterns or components? All right. So moving on, let's talk about common design components. Being able to understand and use the right terminology will help you better communicate with other designers and developers. As with any language, the nomenclature of design and development is constantly changing, and different organizations often refer to different elements by different names. But it's still good to have a foundation in the terminology in order to better communicate with team members. So we're going to take a look at patterns in Bootstrap. And let me share this all with you so that you can follow along. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with Bootstrap, Bootstrap is basically an HTML and CSS design template used for components. You do not need to worry about HTML and CSS as I'm going over each component. We're just purely revealing the pieces that you see on the left-hand side just to get a basic understanding of what each of these mean. And so we won't go through every single one. I do have the link available in Training Kit as well if you'd like to go back and take a look. So we'll cover a few that I think that I've seen that are commonly used in designs. So the first one that we have here is our breadcrumbs. And this is basically going to help support wayfinding. And breadcrumbs are, think of them as a trail of links that tell the user where they're located on a website. And so Bootstrap will have a couple of different examples of what that looks like here. So we have a person who's landed in home, but then they go into the library section and then they're in data. And so this is going to allow the user to inform them that they're in the data section. A realistic example is REI. So you may see this in e-commerce sites. So one example is REI uses wayfinding. And in this example, I'm looking at climbing harnesses. So I know that I'm in climbing harnesses based on the breadcrumbs that are shown here. And then if I click back into climbing, I know that I'm in the climbing section. So that is another form of breadcrumbs that we see in sites like this. Questions on breadcrumbs?
It's similar to how you would have folders within folders and kind of, what is it called? Where you're hiding stuff within other categories and folders.
I can't think of the name that you're trying to think of.
Is it nesting?
It's nesting.
Yes.
Nesting?
It's nesting.
Yes, nesting.
Cool. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Okay. So another commonly used component are cards, which I've seen in some of your Build Week projects. And cards are going to be a flexible component that typically contain blocks of text and a button, and sometimes they also contain images. There are other examples of cards. So here, this is without any sort of image, and they have 2 different links associated with it. And we see cards used a lot throughout website experiences. So one that comes to mind that I see is used in National Geographic. If this wants to load. So I believe it's throughout their landing page where they have cards set up. All right, let's take a look at Airbnb. Airbnb will also have cards that they use, so they don't look exactly like we see in the Bootstrap component for cards, but they have it laid out in a very similar way where they have the image and then they have a block of text that's associated with it. Oh, here we go. And here's another example of cards that we see that's also used in National Geographic. So they have this shown on their landing page. Here they have it broken up where they have their image, they have some title, blocks of text, and then they would have a link embedded in there. If you'd like to learn more about cards, Material Design also has a great resource for cards. And even in some of their UI kits, you can play around with them and see what that could look like. So in their design system here, which we'll take a closer look at tomorrow, you could see what certain things look like as you start to build upon it. So this is also a great resource to play around with cards if you're interested in that component. Questions on cards? All right. This next one is a carousel. So carousels are, let's pull this example. Carousels are a bunch of images, or perhaps it could be marketing material where they may auto scroll or the user may need to go in and click on an actual button to view content. And while this is a very, very well-known component, this is not widely recommended to use as part of your interface because you are actually hiding content. So this, for example, in a landing page, you might have someone that comes to your page, they never click on the button, they will never discover the rest of the content that lives within the carousel. You may find this on e-commerce websites. I know in my previous company, we used this a lot. So it was always a battle between stakeholders and designers where stakeholders wanted a lot of marketing material on the landing page. And so this was kind of the balance between the two where we added a carousel. So those might be little things that happen when you are a UX designer working in the field. But the key takeaway is carousels are not typically a great component to use in your designs because we're hiding images or we're hiding content. but I think this is, I wanted to at least bring this up and showcase what a carousel is for those of you who may not be familiar with it. Questions on carousels?
I had a quick question.
Mhm.
So a carousel would only show one topic at a time that you could scroll through. What if, like, if it's a lot of cards that you could scroll through? Is that a carousel as well?
I wouldn't classify that as a carousel. I would just call it, like you did, cards. But I think that you're also may run into the same challenge where you're going to have content that's undiscoverable. What I would recommend with something like that, I've seen that in particular designs where you have to swipe over to see more elements. That is something that you could also test with user testing to see if that is discoverable and if people recognize that there's additional content.
So that type of scrolling where you have several cards, that's not called a carousel.
That is not, no, I would not call that a carousel.
So a carousel, I guess I'm trying to understand the difference between the two. So
Yeah.
a carousel would only have like one thing at a time?
Yeah, let's see if my, oh, they don't have it here. But you would typically see it in this sort of format where you'd have to click on the arrow button to get to the next image. And they're typically used in landing pages.
Okay, cool, thank you.
Sure.
Can it also be auto play? Still considered a carousel as long as it's one large image?
Yes.
Cool. Nike's website has that.
Nike's? Cool. All right.
Yesterday it moved.
Yeah. Or maybe they're targeting I don't know. But yeah, but yes, typically you would see something like this, and images that auto rotate would also be considered a carousel. All right, we're going to talk about this in a little bit, modals. And so this is actually a really, really good example. We'll talk about how this could feel a little disruptive to the user. And I'm happy this showed up because I could not find an example. And so we will leave that there. All right, so moving on to the next one, we have drop downs. Oh, so there we go, it's the auto carousel. Drop downs. So drop downs are going to display a list of options. And so here's one example. We click down and we have all of our options that are displayed. And it can be easy to overuse them. For example, we should avoid adding really, really long lists when it comes to creating a drop-down. Let's see if there's other examples. These are all just different button sizes. But a good example of drop-downs, we could see this used in Google Flights. And Google Flights have drop-downs prior to selecting your location and destination. So we have 3 options that are listed. We don't see an exhaustive list of things that we need to select. We're able to also have it customized in the way where the drop-down presents how many adults, children, et cetera, that you can select in terms of quantity. And then again, another example of a drop-down. A good tip is if it's easier to type it than use a drop-down, then just focus on using a text input field, something that we see like this. But if not, sometimes if there are a lot of options and it would be easier to use a drop-down list, for example, it would be really difficult to try to write out premium economy or business or first class, it would be much easier to select it. Then those are cases where we can use drop-downs. What questions do we have about drop-downs?
Are calendars considered drop downs or no?
I
was thinking of using this for my
Yeah.
project. I just couldn't really, I didn't know what it was.
Yes, and I can't think of the word either, but I wouldn't classify this as a drop down only because there's so many different selections that you have to make within it. So I would classify something as simple as this as a drop down, and this I want to say almost like a modal, but that may not be the right terminology that I'm using. But to answer your question, I wouldn't consider this as a drop down just because there's so many interactions that occur within this.
So I think it's the same as a date picker.
Date pickers, yes, which they use in iOS. Almost. Date pickers. Okay, thank you, Serena. All right. Yes, so that would be classified as a date picker and not as a dropdown. Other questions on dropdowns? All right. So the next one are modals. And so here's an example of a modal. They're also known as dialogues, so you'll see them used interchangeably. And they are good in terms of being able to capture a user's attention, but it can be detrimental where it's interrupting a user's current experience. So these should really be only used for critical messages that needs the user's attention. There's also a demo. So if I launch the demo, here is an example of a modal that's appeared. Another example that we were just looking at is Nike. Here, they have a modal that appears requesting me to sign up for their offers. So as you are building out your Build Week project, if you're using modals, always think in context of the user. Always think whether or not having this modal is going to be extremely beneficial to them. If it feels like it's going to be a nuisance, it might be. So we want to make sure that we're careful with the amount of modals that we use in our screens. What questions do we have about modals?
Can modals be the same as tooltips?
Modals be the same as tooltips. So tooltips are going to be treated a little bit differently. Let's actually look at that. Tooltips are used like this, where if you're on a website and you're hovering over a particular icon or button, you'll have something that appears here, which seems less intrusive than actually using a modal. So I would treat those two differently.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. And I guess while we're on here, yeah, so these are examples of tooltips. They are also easy to overdo. Typically, I'll see tooltips used in onboarding processes, but we should also be careful on how often we're using them. Let's see if there's other examples. Yeah, so sometimes we'll use tooltips when there's for example, an info button that appears on the right-hand side, and if we were to hover over it, we would be able to read what that is. And they typically look like this, where they don't take up the full page. It's just a small element that appears. Questions on tooltips? Okay. All right. So this next one here is called a nav bar. We have been calling it a navigation bar, but for short we call it a nav bar. And we all built this out last week. So a nav bar is going to be the header of your website. And if we take a look at National Geographic, this is going to be considered their navigation bar. So navigation bars typically have a logo on the top left-hand side with a bunch of links that appear as well. And they may also appear visually distinct from the rest of the content, which we can see here is highlighted by its white background. And this is a very, very common element that you'll see in most designs. Questions on navigation bars? Okay. And then we have spinners. So spinners are going to be these loading components typically used when you're loading websites. They'll look something like this. I believe Airtable uses something similar when you submit a form and there's a little icon that appears. So that is going to be a spinner. In other design or in other style guides, I've seen the word used interchangeably with progress indicator. So that is another terminology that would also fit within this category of spinners. And there's different ways to showcase this, but this is a very common component that I've seen. Questions on spinners? Now, if you are incorporating an animation as part of your Build Week project, so for instance this, unless you're proficient with an animation prototyping tool like InVision Studio, I almost find it really easy just to refer the developer to something that you've seen that actually interacts the way that you want it to behave. So there might be animations that you can pull. So for instance, I may have this icon in my style guide, but it may not actually portray how it works. I might provide this as a resource to let that developer know how it should behave. Okay. And then the other one that I wanted to touch on that doesn't show up here is actually input fields. So I've been using that a lot, but I don't think I've actually gone into describe it. But an input field is going to be a block of an area where you're able to enter text. So in this example here, we have an input field for MailChimp and their sign-up form. This is going to present the label, the text, which is email. This itself is going to be the input field where you're able to type information. We'll get into more detail about error messaging in a little bit, but sometimes input fields have additional text that you're able to gather. So you could slightly see it. It's being hidden by all of these, but it'll provide extra information so that the user's entering the right information. So these are all going to be input text fields. Questions on that?
I had one thing. You see how the button is inactive, so it's grayed out. I had feedback from Corey, an instructor that I had for mine, and he was giving me feedback because I had inactive and active buttons about thinking about people who might be disabled and not understanding how to fully make that button active. So what are your thoughts on that?
Not being able to build it out to make it?
No, like if someone was to fill out this right now and they, let's say the upper and lowercase bullet points weren't there and it just had an inactive button, and let's say a disabled person might not understand fully how to activate that button and to have error states instead of having an inactive button. Like if they put in their email and push get started, it would generate an error versus like not being able to get that button activated. See, it's not working.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Um,
You don't need to be disabled. Like I don't get it either sometimes.
yeah. Well, yeah, he was just talking to me about that. Like, you know, like you got to like think about different kinds of people and like, will someone be able to understand how to activate that button?
Yeah.
Because like normally we don't put those little bullet points there. Like it's just the fields and then the button. So I mean, like that has details on what you need to put in to activate it. But
Mhm. Yeah, I could see how for some folks, they may just come across the screen and think this is broken. That is something that I've tested in the past where they'll enter in the information and they won't read everything and they'll just keep clicking on this and they won't see anything change. So that is definitely something that you will want to test to make sure that it's clear when it comes to just presenting error messaging and informing the user what they need to do in order to complete a task. Cool. Other questions on any of the components that we've reviewed?
I had a quick question. So when you're designing a website, so you have a landing page, what are the other pages called once you're inside the, the website? Like different tabs? Because I'm designing a web page and I don't know how to label each different segment.
So that goes back to I think you all did almost like a card sorting exercise. Does that sound familiar?
Mm-hmm.
So I would say that those sections are going to be the title of your pages. And those titles are going to be what makes most sense to users. So if you use something called, is it optimal sort or optimal card, you can actually do a user test exercise where you'll have all these different naming conventions and users will tell you what it means to them and whether it actually aligns with your thought process as to what the title should be. So basically being able to label those different sections are going to come from the testing that you're going to conduct to make sure it matches your user's mental model. But typically I would just call it as, you know, I have my subscribe section, my shop section, my menu section. That's how I would describe those other sections of the page.
So you would use the word section, not like, for example, not sign up page. Is that?
It depends who I'm talking to, but the more specific that you can be, so for example, you just use sign up page, that's fine. Sign up page, sign up section. There's not a specific
Okay.
terminology that I'm aware of, but
All
as
right.
long as you can make it clear.
All right. Thank you so much.
Sure. All right. Any final questions on components? Okay. All right, so let's do this. Let's take a 5-minute break and then we'll talk about interaction patterns. All right, see you in 5 minutes. Okay, welcome back, everyone. All right. So at this point, we've already talked about what are design systems. We went through a couple of different examples. Then we went into identifying common design components. And the next piece that we'll touch on are interaction design patterns. All right. So as of now, when it comes to designing user interfaces, a lot of our screens have just been static screens, especially when we're looking at them in Figma. Instead, we should think of these screens like dynamic conversationalists who actively engage users in an interesting discussion. So for example, think of a time when you interacted with the user interface. What happened when you clicked on the button or submitted a form? An example that I used previously was what happened when you submitted an Airtable form. Was there a loading button that appeared? What was that interactivity or conversation that you had with that form once you had submitted it? So you probably have noticed that your interface responded with new information and feedback that we were able to react to. Being able to design that same conversation between users and your interfaces is what we call interaction design. And there are a few common interaction design patterns that we'll be focused on for this module. But there are, in fact, an endless assortment of states that you can design for your user interfaces. We'll just focus on the common ones. We'll go through each one and then we can take a look at a more granular level how they work with live websites. So the first one is going to be an error state. That is going to let the user know that basically an error has occurred. And we can use Google in as example. If we're typing in a Word document and we've spelt a word incorrectly, we see the red squiggly lines that will appear on the bottom of the word. Or sometimes when we're, oh, can you not hear me? I don't know who was that was speaking.
I think that was Ivan.
Oh, is it just Ivan that can't hear me?
I can hear you.
You can hear me? All right. If one of the TLs could just reach out to Ivan and help him out, that would be great. Everyone else hears me. I don't know if you got that. Okay, thank you. All right, error states, so again, thinking back to the example, typing a word incorrectly, or sometimes you may have filled out a form and maybe you didn't enter in the right amount of characters for your password and something appears letting you know that you haven't met the requirements. The second is going to be validation states. So this is going to tell the user that the data that they've provided is not in the proper format. For example, if you were to fill out a form where they requested a birth date, perhaps maybe you didn't enter it in the correct format where they wanted 2 digits for the date, 2 digits for the 2 digits for the month, 2 digits for the date, and 4 digits for the year. That could be an error or validation state that tells the user that they haven't entered it in the proper format. The third piece are hover states. So we see this used frequently with buttons in order to increase their affordance, meaning letting the user know that this is a button that they can take action on. And then we have loading states that we just reviewed. These loading states let the user know that something is happening after an interaction. So think back to the spinners that we were just looking at and the Bootstrap components. That would be an example of a loading state. Or if we think back to IBM's Carbon design system, they had the skeleton states where they were gradually loading content, or they had those gray rectangles. That would be another example of a loading state. The next is a selected state. So this communicates that an element has been selected by the user. And a good example that we'll showcase is Trello. So for example, if you've ever used Trello and you've created a checklist, being able to select one of the checkboxes is going to let the user know that an element has been selected. And then active states, this is going to provide context for the user about what type of content that they're viewing. This is common in tabbed views, where if you think of, for example, Instagram and you're interacting with it with a tabbed view on the bottom, we know that we are viewing the dashboard feed or however you call it when the active state is highlighted by the different color of its icon. And then lastly, we have the disabled state, which we were just looking at in MailChimp's example, where this communicates a non-interactive element. So let's switch gears and actually take a look at these examples and see what questions you may have. So a good example of error states is the reference was the Google Docs. Let me pull that up. Okay. So we can actually take a look at our assignment for this afternoon, or we'll just use this. But error states are going to let the user know that there's something that they need to correct. So the example that I'd used previously is if I were to spell something incorrectly, and let's say I was trying to spell the word carousel, I should theoretically get, there we go. All right, here we go. So this is letting me know that an error has occurred where these red squiggly lines appear. Another example is when we're filling out forms. So here's one from onlinemba.unc. So as I gradually continue to fill out the information here, and if I click on the submit button, this would populate an error. This would let me know that there are items that need my attention that I have not filled out. What questions do we have about error states?
Question. So what if your, how would you handle error states if your primary brand color is red or somewhere like almost red, like Yelp, for example?
I am thinking back to Verizon, where they were using a lot of reds in their colors. And for their error state, the way that we would treat it were a couple of different ways. We might have actually used alerts. And so let me refer back to the Bootstrap components. So one way that we treated errors is we used alerts that were actually different colors that were not red. And then also too, just using red as a primary color can be very overwhelming. So you may want to stay away from that. Is there a brand in particular that you have in mind where they're able to use, that they use red as their primary color?
Yes, I use Yelp a lot. And also it made me think of Lambda. Yeah.
It's in the new form, I think, right?
Mhm.
The new Lambda Sprint form. They use red.
The active and error state are just a slightly different color reds.
Interesting. Okay. I would actually recommend using a different color. So you don't necessarily always have to use red for errors. There's other ways to depict that without using the color red, which we've done in some of the work that I did with my previous company. And I think we purposely did that only because we didn't want to feel like we were screaming at the user. Like, this is, to me, when I'm looking at this, it's clear and it tells me that there are things that I need to fix, but it's very, very loud because I'm using this bright red. So Gabe, the answer to your question is they could be using a different shade, but that could appear really confusing because you don't want somebody to visit your site and think that everything that they're completing could be an error. So I would advise using a completely different color to illustrate that.
Awesome, thank you.
Sure, that's a really good point. Other questions on error states?
I posted the link in the main channel. If you actually click in the field box, it turns red.
Yes, this is something else that I've seen too. With things like this, we also would want to make sure that it is accessible. So somebody who sees in grayscale only may be able to notice it. So something to, I'm sure, took into consideration with this. Cool. All right. So moving on to the next piece, we have our validation state. And this is going to tell us again that our format isn't in the correct, isn't inputted correctly. So actually we could refer back to UNC. And let's see. So this could be another example where our format is not accurate and it's displaying to us what we need to fix. Maybe there's a better example that we can find with MailChimp. This is also another example of validation states that MailChimp uses. So in this case, this is related to the password field where I haven't used the correct lowercase or meeting the 8-character minimum. Questions on validation states? All right, so hover states. They're going to be used to increase affordances. And I believe MailChimp actually has hover states that they use. All right, so here we go. We're on MailChimp's landing page. If I were to hover over pick a plan, we notice that this gradually darkens this teal or blue color. So this is also what we see in websites that they'll use in order to increase affordance to let the user know that this is clickable. Another example is this learn more. So as we hover over it, we have this underlined view. Questions on hover states?
Do we know if our developers can create hover states for us?
I think it's going to depend who you're working with. So what I would do is if I were, I don't know if Gabe was going to chime in.
Yeah, it's actually very easy to implement. We can implement hover, active, focus. Like if you're like in the Airtable form, you notice if you're hovering over a field, the border becomes a little thicker. Mm-hmm. And then when you actually select the field, it becomes red. That's very easy to implement. Yeah, very, very doable. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gabe. Mm-hmm. Cool. So as part of your assignment, we're going to explore making these, so that way you'll have that also available for your developers, and hopefully, like Gabe mentioned, that they'll be able to implement it.
I've got a quick question actually about something similar. So when we're creating our like our prototypes and our wireframes, I bless you. With like the inactive hover state and the active hover state, do we need to like copy the whole screen and recreate it, or like copy it and then just change the button so it shows active when we do it in the prototype? Or is there a less messy way to do that?
Okay, so your question is, do you have to replicate every single screen with all those different states?
Yeah, uh-huh.
So Ash is like, no, you don't have to. So you do not need to.
Okay.
You can do it once, and then you're basically communicating this to your devs. So you'd be like, every time I hover over a link, I would like it to change this color, and then you can show them one example of like, maybe you have the sign in a hover color state, and then they'll know, like they note it, so you don't have to recreate every single one. But
Gotcha.
you just need to communicate everything. Basically, it's all about communication.
Okay.
Showing them examples, walking them through how, everything. So
Cool.
yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Ash. Yeah, so that prototyping is going to be really important. And like Ash mentioned, you just have to show it once and that will be sufficient.
Cool. Sounds good. Thank you.
Sure. All right, so next we have our loading state, which we just reviewed. So let me pull up actually another different type of loading state that appears in material design. And they call them progress indicators. So these are also other examples of loading states that could appear that is used in Android designs itself. Questions on loading states? Okay. All right. The next interaction pattern that we were discussing is selected states. So again, selected states communicate that an element has been selected by the user. And if we take a look at Trello, any of you have a Trello board, this is going to come in handy for Build Week, but we can talk more about that next week. But for Trello, we have, we can see an example of a selected state. If we were to add a checklist within Trello, so if I were to select this, this would show that it's in the selected state. Questions on selected states?
I have a question, not about selected states, but actually for loading states. Is this just for psychological assurance, or is there actually stuff happening? Are we really waiting for something?
Yeah, so there's actually stuff that's happening in the background.
Okay, just making sure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. It's a good question. Other questions? Okay. And then our second to last interaction pattern is going to be our active states. So this is going to provide context to the user about what type of content that they're viewing. And a good example of this is back to Google Doc. So here we have active states. For example, if I look at the details here, I'm currently, my text is currently going to be bolded, or maybe it's also italicized. So these are examples of providing context to the user, what the content that they're viewing, and this can be exemplified by examples such as highlighting the bold and the italic. Questions on selected states, or I'm sorry, active states? And then lastly, we have our disabled states, which communicates a non-interactive element. So we can look at MailChimp again as an example of disabled states. And that was a great point that Ash had brought up previously. With inactive states, that is something that I would encourage you all to test. I take a look at this, and again, you may have somebody who, depending on your user, whether they're tech savvy or not, they might think that this is actually broken. This isn't an element that I've seen used in designs, but it's also good to get feedback to see if this is something that is recognizable by your user. Questions on disabled states? All right. Questions on any of these? All right, so as part of your assignment, which I'll go into more detail at the end of this lesson, you will be continuing to build upon your style guide, but you will also take into consideration these interaction design patterns or patterns, so that way you have a library that the developers can also refer back to once you get closer to build week. All right. So before we get into our guided project, the last topic that we'll touch on is converting our low fidelity to high fidelity designs. So we are finally going to start moving everything over into high fidelity mockups. And we begin this process by using our tool of choice, which is going to be Figma, and making sure that we have our style library in place, our style guide. So we want to make sure that in order to make sure that this is a successful process, that we're setting up our document correctly, and that we're making smart incremental updates to our high fidelity designs over time. As our high fidelity designs are tested and vetted with users and stakeholders, we want to feel confident that we can make stylistic changes easily without the need to update every design. So a few tips in terms of moving these over to high fidelity. The first is just making sure that we have a style library in place. And we've been building upon this for the last week and a half. We talked about how to set up your master components in place. We created a color palette. We created a typographic scale. So this is all building towards your style library that you will be sharing with your developers. Then the second bullet point here is, with our high fidelity design, what we want to have is that we're showcasing realistic copy. So we really need to make sure that we stay away from using placeholder copy like Lorem Ipsum, which we may have had in our wireframes. But as we start converting it to high fidelity design, we want to use the copy that already exists, or maybe it's brand new copy that we will have to create on our own. For instance, if you're working with a company who already has a website in place and you're purely just doing a redesign, feel free to use the existing copy that's available. You want to make sure that your design seems as realistic as possible. And then another example is sometimes designs will have no copy where they have titles called title. Just make sure that you're giving the viewer a sense of the information, even if it's not final. Copy can gradually change, that's okay, but try to make it as realistic as possible. And then the final one is generating unique content. So what I mean by that is, on Friday, we took a quick look at something called Data Lab, where we're able to generate real content, such as names and dates. And so if we were to create a dashboard, and let's say the dashboard had multiple names, we wouldn't want to repeat the same content over and over, where we would have Jane Doe and the same phone number throughout that list. In this example, we want to make sure that the content is unique from one another, so that we're not using the same name and same phone number that repeats through this list. So I'll share Data Lab again. in the Slack channel, but you can use that plugin in order to generate unique content. Unique content is going to make your designs feel more realistic and help your users and stakeholders better understand the vision of the product. All right, so what questions do we have about high fidelity design? Do you all hear a dog barking in the background? Okay, no, yes? All right, just give me 2 seconds. I'm house sitting and this poor dog is barking, but see if there's any questions. I'll be right back. Okay, sorry about that. She unsuccessfully wants to join me, so apologize in advance if you hear the dog barking in the background. All right, so what questions do we have about converting our lo-fi to hi-fi design? Okay. All right, so what we're going to do next is let's go into our guided project. And let me share with you all the Figma link that's available. And so we're going to build upon what I was showcasing on Friday. So let me add this into Slack. Oh, yes, Gabe, thank you for calling that out. So when designing for hover states, keep in mind that it can't be done for mobile.
Learn the hard way.
Thank you for calling that out. So yes, your TLs, your SL have gone through Build Week themselves. So all of this that they're sharing with you is such great information. So keep all of this in the back of your heads so that way you can all prepare as we get closer to Build Week. Okay, so feel free to go ahead and make a copy of this page here. And yeah, you can just go ahead and duplicate the style guide. Just come in and copy and paste. And what we're going to do is we're going to build upon the style guide. So in order of importance of what your developer is going to expect to see when you go into Build Week is first and foremost your user flow that we talked about yesterday. They need to make sure that they're able to understand the foundation of your screens and how they relate to one another and how a user is going to interact with the product. So I know there are some teams that have added their whimsical user flow in their canvas, which is great. So that way you can refer back to it as you're building out your screens. So once you have that, the second piece that is going to be really important that they will be working on are these components. They'll need to make sure that they understand what they need to build out so that way they can make sure that your mock-ups come to life. So in terms of creating a style guide, I would recommend just having a separate page dedicated to your style guide. You may even have a separate section that has all of your master components. And so you can treat these separately if you'd like. But in this first example, we've all created our type scale. And so you would just go ahead and just copy and paste that over as part of your style guide. I think most of you already have this. And if you like, you could just clean it up a bit. So here I've listed out what the individual characters are going to look like, lowercase and uppercase. I have this listed as my primary font. And I also have all of these broken out by the size. So that way a developer could easily go in and say, okay, I get that H1 is supposed to be this particular size, whereas body text would be at about 18. Now, the second piece to building out your style guide is making sure that you have a section dedicated to your color palette. So I'm going to actually slide these over, and you all should have a color palette in place based on what you all created that first week or last week. And when it comes to creating your color palette, just make sure that you're being very clear in highlighting what are the primary colors that are used. Actually, if we look back at, let me pull. Okay, so this was what we worked with last week. All right. So it doesn't matter if you make them circle or rectangular. I was just exploring what that looks like. But you can start to carry these over. So here, if I click on Control-C and highlight over this, I can start modifying my color palette, making sure that I have the hex code. And we touched briefly on this last week, but there is a really, really handy tool that Gabe had shared or had talked about where you're able to create a name for this particular color. So rather than exchanging conversations and saying this should be an F1, F7, FD, you can use this tool called Name That Color. And go ahead and paste in that hex code into this little block here, and it will automatically come up with a name for that color. So this would be called Salago. So if I were to ask somebody to change this to this blue background color, instead of using the hex code, I could just say, just change it to Salago. So as you start building this out, you will continue to add all of the colors over, again with its hex codes.
I have a template I can drop that I made that has like a color palette thing if you want, and then you guys can duplicate it and just keep it like on the side.
That would be fantastic.
I'll drop it in the 7 channel and the main channel, and just if you guys want it, just duplicate it.
Thank you, Ash.
You're welcome.
So we won't go through every single one, but the point is just making sure that you have your color palettes in place and that you have a name. So this one's called Denim. And then so gradually you will start to build out what your primary colors are. Then you would start to move over and create your accent colors. And you could list those as well. And a much easier way to do this is if you actually create a component, you can just easily go in and change it. So I just clicked on Option Command K as a component, renamed it to color palette, and I could just take an instance of this and just go ahead and change it so everything is centered. All right. What questions do we have adding our color palette and typography or type scale in? So I know that we are going to be moving our lo-fi into hi-fi. What I would do is if you are adding more colors in by a case-by-case basis, make sure that your color palette reflects that. If there are colors that you just end up not using, store them away so that way the developers don't get confused as to why you are only using 2 different shades of blue when in reality you have 5. So always constantly check back with your style guide as well as your master components to make sure that everything is organized. All right, so then moving on, we have our components. And this is what we've been working with. So some of you may have broken it up by low fidelity and high fidelity. If you have, don't worry about sharing the low fidelity with your developers. That is something that is going to be relevant to you. So in this case, we should have a section dedicated to components. At this point, we would start taking inventory of all of our screens and gathering all of these different components that exist. So if I refer back to these wireframes, I would make sure that I have an inventory of these short input fields, as well as these long ones, and as well as these buttons. Some of you may have secondary buttons, some of you might have text links. So go back into your files, collect everything so that you have an inventory of them and add them as part of your components. So here we have an example where I've added in the short input text field, the long input text field, and we have our primary button as well as our secondary button. And if you'd like to get really detailed, you could start labeling them where this can be your input fields. And my constraints are a little messed up, so they're going to move. But and then maybe also a second section that's dedicated to buttons. So this is almost like a user experience project in itself, where if somebody were to come in here for the first time, they'd be able to understand where they can find what they need. So they could come in and say, all right, these are all our typefaces, these are all the sizes, these are all the colors, these are all the components. All right, I have it broken down by input fields, I have it broken down by buttons. So it's also really important that you stay organized. So take inventory of everything that you have and stay organized when it comes to creating your components. What questions do we have about this piece? One thing to also keep in mind is developers will also come in and to make sure that what they're building out matches what your mockups show is they'll also come in and will refer to all of the sizes. So if you have in your components library this input field that's set at 167 width and 44 pixels in terms of height, that is what they're going to be building out. So make sure that everything is really organized and accurate. Okay. So then the next piece that we were just going over, so we touched on a couple of interaction design patterns. And this is where we could focus in on, actually, let me just get rid of this to keep it consistent. This is where we could go in and build out the different patterns that we touched on. For example, error states, hover states, loading states. So an example here is if I were to create an error input fields, I could showcase what that would look like to the developer. For example, maybe very similar to what we've seen in the Lambda form, that we have the outline of this could be this red that we have shown in our accent color. Let's try this. Or maybe Another example could be when we're editing a text field. And this will happen with desktop. Just use this as an example. Maybe there is an indicator that appears where we have hint text like this. And I'm just going to change that color to maybe a gray. I'm going to change this to Hugo because that is not the right text. And so maybe we'll have something like this that will illustrate once the user clicks in this. Other examples that we were just looking at is something that Gabe had pointed out earlier in the Lambda forums. This is also showcasing as a hover state where it's increasing the affordance to let the user know that they've selected your name. So maybe there's a hover state. And maybe that weighs a little bit heavier. So these are things that you'll want to think of as you're building out your style guide. It's not all about what your static screens are going to look like, but what happens when you start to interact and have that conversation with your screens. Also keep in mind that without having prototyped out your screens, this might be a little bit more challenging to put together. So what I would recommend is if you haven't done so already, start prototyping out a couple of screens, see what patterns will be relevant, and then start adding them in as part of your style guide. What we don't want to do is just arbitrarily create things that may not be useful or may not fit into our experience. And so if, for example, if this is something that does not exist, just don't add it in. That way you're not creating confusion. Questions on creating patterns? So here's an example. Let's finish up the buttons. Maybe if I hover over this guy, I can, oh, is this a component? Maybe this becomes a little bit darker. And maybe this becomes thicker as I hover over it. This is like a small, I don't know if I changed this. All right, here we go. All right. So that is an example as to how you can create your hover buttons. All right, questions on anything that I'll have to fix that. Questions on anything that we worked on as part of the style guide?
Why did you leave the submit buttons? Those were submit buttons, right? Why did you leave them gray? I would have tried to put like the colors that we had.
Yes, yes, that is a great point. I did it out of pure laziness. So they should be, like Laura mentioned, they should reflect the colors here. So let's go ahead and change that. So this could be our primary color. Here, if we have an outline, our stroke can be this blue, and maybe our text is also that primary blue. And then here, our hover can be maybe a darker variation where our text is white. And then here we can also make sure that the button is a darker variation as well. I think that changed. Okay, there you go. So it should look like this. Other questions about how to set this up?
Just so they actually see it next to each other.
Oh, was that a question? I couldn't hear you.
Wouldn't it be good to have like the hover functions of the buttons next to the normal buttons so they can see the contrast between them, the difference?
Yeah, so we could definitely keep them close to one another so that they're able to see. So I purposely just kept them separated from one another, but as long as your file is organized and it clearly illustrates the difference between the components and the patterns, that is fine. You can keep them together.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Sure. All right. Let us move over to our assignment. So this is available under Common Design Patterns. Click into Projects, and we'll go here. And we'll continue to use our Build Week project as we've been doing. And for your afternoon assignment, you'll be building a style guide for your Build Week project. So hopefully most of you will already have this in place, your typographic scale, your color palette that you can pull from last week. Some of you may already have components in place. And so the piece that's going to be new is really these patterns. So as you're building out your style guide, make sure that you have all 4 of these categories listed. And these are just examples. You do not have to have all of these. I just want you to start thinking about what patterns will take place or what interaction design patterns will appear. So add in what's going to be relevant to your specific project. Then you all are going to begin converting your low fidelity wireframes into high fidelity. Make sure that you keep a copy of your wireframes once you start moving it over to higher fidelity. That is something that UX hiring managers may ask for, to see older iterations and older versions of what it looked like prior. So make sure that you duplicate your wireframes, that you have a copy of that before you move it over into high fidelity. And ensure that you're using the style guide that you've created to create a high fidelity version of your design. I have added here, style guide may tweak once you meet with the development team during Build Week. So just like design systems, just like how new features launch or we get requirements from stakeholders, your style guide may change once you get to Build Week. So we have to be very adaptable and open to making those changes. So in order to prep you all, let's try to do a lot of the heavy work. And then that way, once you get into Build Week, there might be some tweaking that needs to be done. But that way you'll have your foundation set. And then as part of your deliverables, ensure in your Google Doc that you have a link to your style guide, and then a link to your Figma board showcasing both your low fidelity and high fidelity mockups. I would actually keep, because you're working on low fidelity and high fidelity, you can keep them on separate pages. That's going to make it a lot cleaner. And this isn't relevant, so we can erase that. So you can have one page dedicated to low fidelity, another page dedicated to high fidelity. And then if there's extra time for stretch goals, you can write a vision for your personal design system in a Google document. I have also linked the Adele.ux pin that we were looking at for you to gather further inspiration. And then as we get closer to Build Week, as a reminder, make sure that your user flows are updated and that they meet MVP. Begin prototyping your screens. Continue to make sure that your file is organized. and continue to make sure that you're working with the layout and baseline grid. One note I want to call out is when I was reviewing some of the assignments, I noticed some of you used a 10 pixel grid. I recommend that you use 4 and 8 just because most of our screens are divisible by 8, and that is also the system that Material Design uses. I've also noticed that with the 10 pixel grid, things just didn't align evenly or correctly. So just triple check your work, make sure that you're using a 4 or 8 pixel grid and that we're not using 10 pixels.
Now, if you've been using 10 pixels, you have to go back and change everything.
Yes.
Well, I have a question about the grids.
Yes, this?
No, the grids. Yesterday,
the grids? Yep.
I was checking how everything was in a baseline, and one of my 2-line texts, the top one will go on baseline, but the bottom one wouldn't. Is that okay? Then I tried to switch the spacing between the lines, but none of them would actually, both of them in a baseline.
I will want to look at your file to see what you're talking about. So let's do this. Send me your file so that I can take a look at it, and then we can troubleshoot what you're having issues with.
Okay.
Okay, cool.
I might have a quick solution for that because I had the same issue yesterday and I played around with the line height a bit, and I found that because I had a 4 pixel grid, if I adjusted the line height to a number divisible by 4, it typically aligned.
Oh.
I haven't tried that, so it might work, yeah.
Yes, yeah, exactly. All right. Thanks, Josh. So there's the line height section over here, which may have been set to auto. So if you're on a 4 pixel grid, just like Josh had mentioned, just make sure your number is divisible by 4. And that way you're able to make sure that everything is aligned.
Okay. Yeah, because I tried tweaking that, but then none of them, I guess I never actually did want divisible by 4.
Okay.
And I was like, my God.
Let's take a look. Just grant me edit access so that way I can go in and see things and change.
Yeah, I'll do that.
Sweet. Okay. All right, so let's move on to the assignment rubric. The first one is just making sure to meet a level 2 that your style guide is organized, that it contains everything that we've talked about here. So a typographic scale, color palette that lists hex code and color, components, patterns. And then for high fidelity design, making sure that our mockups follow a style guide and uses realistic copy, that colors meet accessibility guidelines. So think back to the plugin Stark that we were looking at, and that the colors complement each other, making sure that the type is legible and easy to read, and that the components and patterns are consistent from screen to screen, and that there's little variation. Then for spacing and alignment, making sure that we're following this 4 pixel layout baseline grid, that elements are intentionally placed, elements that are related to each other are grouped closer together, elements that are not related are spaced further apart, and elements are not aligned to each other, but the system is not cohesive, are aligned to each other, but the system is not cohesive across pages. And then these last two, in terms of file format and attention to detail, those have been carried over from yesterday's rubric. So again, just making sure that everything is organized, that there's no grammatical errors, and that your submission follows the requested submission format. What questions do we have about the assignment?
One thing I do want to point out, at least for me, it says that I need permission in order to access the assignment. I'm not sure if it's like that for everyone else.
Miguel, thank you for letting me know.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And let me triple check that the rubric's all set for y'all too. Cool. Anything else? This should be set, Miguel.
Thank you.
Sure. All right. All right, so I did set up office hours that's available, so you could go in and set up time with me if there's anything that you'd like to review in detail. And we're over time, so I'm not going to get to a daily UI. What I'll do in this case is I'll go through and just comment throughout a couple of designs. But tomorrow I'll make sure that we save some extra time so that we can review everyone's work. Okay, thanks everyone. Looking forward to seeing your higher fidelity designs. Enjoy your lunch, and I'll see you all tomorrow. Thanks everyone.